Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to our open forum on Donald Trump's mass expulsion plan for Gaza. My name is Nader Hashemi. I teach Middle East politics here at Georgetown at the School of Foreign Service. This event is co-sponsored by a center that I direct, the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and it's also co-sponsored by the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. This event overlaps with our Gaza lecture series. And today I was reminded that the topic that has brought us here together is actually part of our Gaza lecture series. On March the 18th at noon, Jihad Abu Salim, the director of the Institute for Palestine Studies, will be speaking on the topic, Population Transfer from Gaza, a short history from 1948 to 2025. Next week, we're hosting Kenneth Roth, the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, who will be promoting his new book, Righting Wrongs, 3 Decades on the Front Line and Battling Abusive Governments. He'll be speaking about Gaza and Israel-Palestine more broadly, and all the details for these events can be found on our website. Khalid El-Gindi was supposed to be here today, but due to an illness, he could not make it. So in his place, Matt Duss has agreed to participate in this panel instead of Khalid, and I'll introduce Matt and the other panelists in a moment. We do have a policy here at Georgetown that before we begin any public event, we have a freedom of speech policy that has to be read in public, just so that we are in good legal standing in case anything disruptive happens. So I'll turn it over to Jonathan to read that policy.
Thank you for coming to this session. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the maximum exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that audience members may not share the same views as the speaker, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event will respect the right of the speaker and the organizing department to share their perspectives and ideas and not cause a disruption to the event's activities. At the end of the event, there will be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions. Please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question. And in the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and ask only one question. Thank you.
On February the 4th, President Donald Trump stunned the world when he announced a US-led effort to control and redevelop the Gaza Strip. Standing beside him, a smiling Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, praised the president for his, quote, willingness to think outside of the box. The looming question hanging over Trump's vision for Gaza and his idea of turning it into a, quote, Riviera of the Middle East is what happens to the 2 million Palestinian inhabitants living in the context of a genocidal situation. Trump was clear in his belief that they should vacate the territory, move to new lands, possibly Jordan, Egypt, or elsewhere, and critically, he since clarified that they do not have the right to return. Since February the 4th, almost every day when Trump has had the opportunity to comment on his vision for Gaza, he's doubled down on his plan. This is now official US policy. While his staff has slightly tried to roll back Trump's initial announcement by affirming that there will be no US troops in Gaza, the entire administration is very firm in believing that the United States intends to control and own Gaza and to determine its future destiny. Other foreign policy advisors of Donald Trump has affirmed that if the Arab states don't like the plan, they should come up with an alternative plan because the status quo in Gaza and in Israel-Palestine more broadly is unstable and untenable. Reportedly, Arab states are right now meeting to come up with an alternative to the Trump plan. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was in Israel recently, and he said that Donald Trump's proposal for Gaza is, quote, something that's bold and something that frankly took courage and vision in order to outline. It may have shocked and surprised many, he said, but what cannot continue is the same cycle where we repeat over and over again and wind up in the exact same place. Netanyahu weighed in and added that Trump's bold vision for Gaza's future and how we can work together to ensure that that future becomes a reality. So we are here today to discuss to analyze and to critique this new U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East. Joining me is Matt Duss. He's the Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy. From 2017 to 2022, Matt was the Chief Foreign Policy Advisor for Senator Bernie Sanders, and before that, he was the President of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He's a distinguished public intellectual. He's been widely quoted and published in the New York Times, Washington Post, etc. Anel Shaleen is a research fellow at the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. She previously served as a foreign affairs officer at the U.S. State Department before resigning in March of 2024 in protest over the Biden administration's unconditional support for Israel's military operations in Gaza. She's working on a book on religious authority in the Middle East, and she's also an adjunct lecturer here at Georgetown, and she's published and has been interviewed widely in the mainstream press. And last and certainly not least is Josh Rubner. He's an adjunct lecturer at Georgetown University's program in Justice and Peace, where he actually teaches a course on justice and peace in Israel-Palestine. He recently completed his doctoral dissertation entitled A Tragedy of Catastrophic Proportions, the United States and the Palestinian Nakba, 1947 to 1949. Josh just told me that his dissertation will be published soon by a prestigious press. I'm not sure if I can mention the press. No, he says, but it will be published soon, and we look forward to organizing a book talk for Josh. He's also the author of a book, Shattered Hopes, Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace, and another book, Israel, Democracy or an Apartheid State. Currently, Josh works as a policy director at the Institute for Middle East Understanding. The format for this event is going to be a public conversation. We're going to leave a lot of time for audience interventions because this has been advertised as an open forum. I've asked each of the panelists here to sort of respond to an initial broad question, to sort of shape the conversation, and to take at least 5 minutes to answer an initial broad question. And that question is the following: what is the appropriate historical, political, and moral context to understand Trump's Gaza plan? This plan didn't come out of nowhere. There is a historical, I think, political and moral context that we need to, I think, have some understanding of before we can understand this topic at a deeper level. So I'm going to turn the floor over to our panelists to answer that question, and I'll start with Josh.
Thank you very much, Ned. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you all for being here today. I think I'll tackle the historical aspect of the opening question in large part. We need to view Zionism as a settler colonial project that is no different in its manifestations from other settler colonialisms that we've seen throughout the world over the past few centuries. And as we learn from the scholar of settler colonial and genocide studies, Patrick Wolf, settler colonialism is something that is predicated upon the elimination of the native, the elimination of the indigenous population. And this elimination of the native can be done in many different ways. And different methods of eliminating the native can be employed by the settler colonial society at different times along this path. And what Patrick Wolf teaches us is that settler colonialism should be seen as a structure and not as an event. In other words, this is a long-term, ongoing process. So when we talk about Trump green-lighting Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza outside of their homeland, we're not talking about a new idea. We're talking about something that has its basis in Zionism and in the praxis of the state of Israel since 1948. And to really understand the severity of the implications of Trump's outlandish proposal, we have to understand its historical setting, which is the Nakba, the catastrophe, which refers to the fact that Israel's establishment was predicated on the destruction of indigenous Palestinian society in 1948. Israel expelled approximately 75 to 85% of the indigenous Palestinian population from what became the territory of the state of Israel. And the only reason today that Israel is a state that has a majority of its inhabitants who are Jewish is because of the ethnic cleansing that took place in 1948. And because Israel has disallowed, in defiance of international law and UN resolutions, the right of Palestinian refugees to return to the homeland from which they were exiled more than 75 years ago. Israel tried to eliminate the natives in 1948, not only by expelling them, but by demolishing their towns and their villages and their cities, renaming them in many cases with Hebraicized words to literally efface the Palestinian presence from the land. So this is something that Palestinians have been struggling against for more than 75 years, this attempt to ethnically cleanse them from their homeland. And we should not view the Nakba as a historical event only. Dr. Hanan Ashrawi coined the term the ongoing Nakba to describe the ongoing displacement, the ongoing ethnic cleansing to which Palestinians continue to be subjected on a daily basis. And we can see how this ongoing Nakba impacted the population of Gaza. So there were only 80,000 Palestinians in what became the Gaza Strip before Israel's establishment in 1948. Israel's ethnic cleansing pushed more than 240,000 Palestinian refugees into this tiny space of historic Palestine, only 2% of the land. So you had an immediate quadrupling of the population of Palestinians in Gaza in 1948. But the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their homeland into Gaza did not end in 1948. In fact, in the archives of the United States, you can find evidence that even through 1950, Israel was continuing to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from within towns and cities that it controlled, like Ascalon and Asdod, and deported violently and forcibly thousands more Palestinians who are supposed to be citizens of the state of Israel into Gaza. So the modus operandi of the state of Israel has always been to control as much of historic Palestine as possible with the least number of Palestinians in that territory as possible. So this is the historic context we need to keep in mind when we assess Trump's plan. Today, 2/3 of all Palestinians in Gaza are refugees. So when we talk about the right of Palestinians to resist their forcible ethnic cleansing from their homeland, from Gaza, when we talk about the right of Palestinians to rebuild their homes and their lives within Gaza, all that is important, but it's not enough, because we also need to talk about how these Palestinian refugees who have been exiled from their home for more than 75 years can actuate and effectuate their right to actually return home as well, to the villages, towns, and cities from which they were expelled by Israel more than 75 years ago. Now, let me say one more piece before I turn it over to my co-panelists. Let's not lay all the blame for this at Trump's feet. Let's also acknowledge the fact that President Joe Biden laid the groundwork for these expulsion policies that Trump is now promoting. This is not a Republican versus a Democratic thing. Absolutely not. Here are two ways in which President Joe Biden laid the groundwork for what President Trump has proposed. Number one, he was just fine with Israel committing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians within the Gaza Strip. More than 9 out of every 10 Palestinians were forcibly displaced by the Israeli military from their homes. So we've already seen massive ethnic cleansing by Israel within Gaza. That's one factor we should consider. The second factor we should consider in understanding how President Biden laid the groundwork for this ethnic cleansing proposal by President Trump is by looking to his very first supplemental appropriation request in the fall of 2023, when he put in a line item, I think it was for $40 million, and maybe some of you can correct me if I got the exact number wrong here, but he put in a line item in this budget request for the U.S. assisting Palestinians who found themselves displaced beyond the borders of historic Palestine. And this was against the backdrop of the Israeli intelligence ministry putting forward a detailed memo and a detailed plan for actually expelling the 2 million plus Palestinians from Gaza into the barren Sinai Desert in Egypt. So President Biden put forward this request for money, knowing full well that it was Israel's intent to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza into Egypt. So let's lay blame where it belongs, with Donald Trump as well as with President Biden.
Thanks so much. It's a real honor to get to be here and to speak with you all. So really appreciate Josh laying that out so definitively. I think it's also just to actually build directly upon that. What's been so maddening for me in hearing people react to this idea that Trump displacing 2 million Palestinians from Gaza will solve the issue is, as Josh said, this has been the policy of the state of Israel for decades, and it has not led to peace or stability. And so the question, therefore, is why do they think it would be any different this time? Another note on what Josh said in terms of when this proposal of displacing Palestinians from Gaza was floated, the reaction from Egypt and Jordan was a hard red line, which they have tried to give again. Biden was willing to listen to them. Trump so far appears to be willing to pressure them. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So to respond to Nader's overall question of what is the appropriate historical, moral, and political context for this, I'm not going to try to offer a definitive answer, but just a few points that I think are useful for our understanding. One is the effect of 9/11 and the US war on terror and the way that the suffering and death of people in the Middle East was normalized and was also portrayed as somehow contributing to the security of Americans, of white Americans, similarly to how the security of primarily Israeli Jews of European descent, that their security is seen as premised on the death and suffering of largely Muslim Palestinians. And that part of this was also the normalization of Islamophobia, that we saw at that time the willingness to conflate Islam with terrorism, which was really never pushed back against. Similarly, we see today the way that the state of Israel refers to all Palestinians as terrorists or is willing to classify them as such and treat them as such. And for me, this in many ways goes back to something Biden said very early on after October 7th, where he warned Israel against repeating the mistakes of 9/11, saying to avoid vengeance. And I think, unfortunately, from Israel's perspective or from Netanyahu's perspective, the lesson from 9/11 was that the US was able to engage in horrific levels of violence, to break international law, to break US law, and there was never any accountability for any of that. There was never any reckoning. No one lost their jobs. No one really even suffered from a reputational perspective for the horrors that the US engaged in the aftermath of 9/11. So unfortunately, I think Israel did learn the lessons of 9/11, which was that you can get away with this and there will be zero accountability. I think another crucial point to keep in mind is, while obviously, I publicly quit my job over this. I mean, I think we're all here because we share such horror at, well, perhaps I won't speak for you all, but many of us in this room share in the grief and horror of what these policies have created. But I do think there are a few areas for optimism, one of which is the way that people have responded and have observed, have pushed back against the dehumanization of Palestinians. And I do think that a large, or at least part of this, comes out of the effects of the Black Lives Matter movement and a national conversation about recognizing the humanity of populations who have long been dehumanized. And what's interesting is to see, even today at rallies, even in Israel, I saw a picture today of someone saying Palestinian lives matter. And so my hope is that it's that energy that is contributing to what we have seen is a shift in the way that Americans, we've seen it in polls, that Americans do, that our views are changing on this, especially among young people, and that moving forward, I do think it will be more and more difficult for sort of the bipartisan consensus on unconditional support for the state of Israel to continue. I think the question will be, what is left of Palestine in the meantime? I'll stop there.
Okay, great thing. Matt, what's the context?
I might pick up on something that Josh said. It's not rare that I say this, but Josh, you're being too kind. And I will say that, of course, you're absolutely right that Biden laid the groundwork for this. But, when I watched Trump and Netanyahu speaking in the White House a couple weeks ago, and I saw a U.S. president and an Israeli prime minister taking it upon themselves to determine the future of the Palestinian people without a Palestinian in the room anywhere near, I saw a great deal of continuity in American foreign policy, unfortunately, not just toward that region, not just toward Palestine, but in general, a kind of a presumption that America, by dint of its great economic and military power, which we're supposed to believe equals moral authority, has the right to determine the future for communities around the world, whether we're talking about through the use of war, whether we're talking through the use of military violence, of economic violence, through an economic model that extracts wealth and exports insecurity and poverty onto populations around the world. So again, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I do think, when I look at Donald Trump, others have observed, I've observed as well, so much of what Donald Trump does that shocks people is just kind of taking the subtext and making it text. A lot of the corruption, a lot of the false assumptions that have undergirded the practice of American policy for a long time. Trump just says it, and then he turns it up to 11. And I think that's part of what we saw there. I mean, I think this idea that it was up to the United States and other powerful governments to make decisions for the future of the region without regard for the populations of this region. This is the logic that undergirds the Abraham Accords. The idea that we're going to cut these deals with these undemocratic regimes, and then the populations that live under these regimes that are unrepresented and governments are not accountable to them. That's, I think, what we saw reflected, that mindset in the Gaza proposal. And frankly, when I look at what's happening right now, these talks between the United States and Russia and Saudi Arabia, there was a real tension, hypocrisy in the Biden administration's approach to Ukraine versus Palestine. For the Ukrainians, it was nothing about the Ukrainians without the Ukrainians, whereas for the Palestinians, we're always free to make decisions that impact them with a little input. Well, Donald Trump is solving that tension in a way that the Ukrainians do not like. And I'm very sorry to see that. Personally, I mean, I hope they can get a peace deal. I think if they can get a workable and durable deal that protects, Ukraine's sovereignty and democracy, we should support it. I want there to be consistency in favor of the Palestinians, though. I think the way we've talked about these two wars in Washington is reflective of just this schizophrenia. On the one hand, there's a people that we admire and whose independence and liberation is just and right and should be supported through the force of arms, and another people who should accept only dominance. So if we're able to surface, I think, some of those hypocrisies and understand some of those continuities, I think that might be a helpful way to understand this.
I agree. There's a lot of continuity between Biden and Trump with respect to Gaza. One of the things that Josh said that he reminded me of, and that's been forgotten, is that in the few weeks after October the 7th, Blinken went around the region trying to convince Egypt to open its doors so that Palestinians can be expelled there. So the one can make the argument that the early ethnic cleansing plan actually was a Biden-Blinken plan before Trump came up with it. But let me play devil's advocate here, because part of the polemics over this moment and the debate here in Washington, D.C. and in the United States over this crazy plan that Trump has, you hear some Democratic voices saying, see, we told you so. All of you young people who decided not to vote for Harris because of Biden's Gaza plan, this is what you've got. We would not be, and I think it's accurate to say, objectively speaking, had Harris won, we would not be organizing an event like this to discuss this topic. Because Harris would not have come up with a plan as insane as Trump's. Other things may have happened, but I mean, who would have thought that she would propose this? I don't think anyone rationally believes that was on the agenda of a Harris administration. So one can make the argument that, maybe things would have been somewhat better given the two choices that we have. How would you respond to that claim? Matt, why don't you take it first, then we'll come down the line.
I don't want to be flip, but unfortunately, I think if Harris had won, we'd be at an event discussing the still ongoing war, because there would not have been a ceasefire, in my view. You can't say for certain, but again, all the evidence, and I wish this was not the case, but all the evidence I've seen was that Harris was not going to depart from the Biden policy, and that policy was no real pressure on Netanyahu, all the pressure, all the blame on the Palestinians and on Hamas, and that would have produced the exact same outcome, which is no ceasefire. So yes, I don't think we would have gotten, I think it's safe to say we would not have gotten a public proposal to displace almost 2 million Palestinians. Getting back to what you said about, people, I find these liberal pundits, I mean, this is just really disgusting. I also find it very strange that, apparently Gaza didn't matter to the election, except when liberal pundits want to blame pro-Palestinian voters for Trump. I mean, you cannot have it both ways. But either way, I would say that let's understand where the blame really lies, and that was on the administration that devised and carried out this policy, and a candidate who unfortunately could not see her way clear to suggest that she would depart from it at all.
Anel or Josh, you want to weigh in on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Matt said, that we've seen polling on that for voters who did vote for Biden in 2020 and decided they were not going to vote for Harris in 2024, the biggest issue for them was Gaza. 29% of them cited Gaza, and that was above immigration or inflation. So although I do think in the aftermath of an election, everybody likes to say it was their pet issue, that was the thing that swung the election, I think in this case, we can argue that being portrayed, that Trump was able to take this mantle of being seen as the peacemaker, not getting into new wars, and unfortunately, here we are.
I'm so glad you mentioned that poll, because that was one that our organization commissioned, the Institute for Middle East Understanding Policy Project. We actually commissioned 2 public opinion polls, one before the election and one after. The one we did before occurred right before the Democratic National Committee met in Chicago to nominate VP Kamala Harris to be its presidential candidate. And we found that in the 3 or 4 swing states that we polled, for every voter that VP Harris would lose if she called for an arms embargo on Israel, guess how many votes she would gain? For everyone she lost, she would gain between 5 and 7 votes in the key swing states that she needed to win the election. And we took that polling data to Chicago, and we tried to bring it to the attention of the DNC, and they saw it, and they understood its ramifications, and they ignored it. Now, let's talk about one more thing about Chicago. Do you remember the biggest applause line for Kamala Harris in her acceptance speech? It was when she called for freedom and self-determination and dignity for the Palestinian people. Not because she was going to translate those words into actions if she were elected. I very much agree with Matt that we would have the same policy as under Biden. But that goes to show you the depth of support that exists within the base of the Democratic Party for Palestinian rights. We've seen poll after poll showing something like 75 to 80% of Democrats want to see a permanent ceasefire. Where do you see those kind of numbers in a poll ever in terms of agreement, right? We've seen poll after poll showing that about 2/3 to 75% of all Democrats support an arms embargo on Israel. This is where the base of the party is at, and it's not being reflected by the party leadership. So we did this other poll in the aftermath of the election, and yes, we found that Kamala Harris's position and Joe Biden's position on Gaza was the top factor why people who voted for Biden in 2020 failed to vote for Kamala Harris in 2024. So if the Democratic Party wants to win future elections, they have to take account of the fact that the base of the party is mobilized and supportive of Palestinian rights and wants to see our foreign policy reflective of that.
Okay, now back to Trump's plan. One of the things that we've heard repeatedly since it was first announced on February the 4th is Trump's foreign policy advisors have repeatedly said, okay, you don't like the plan? Arab states, come up with your own plan. Let's see some new ideas on the table because the status quo is unsustainable. So there's been a lot of talk. There's going to be a big meeting in Riyadh this week, and a further. The question for the panel is: what do we know about this possible Arab state plan for the future of Gaza? Do we have any details? Will it have any legs? That's the next question. Anel, do you want to sort of weigh in on this? You've sort of written about Jordan recently, and you've been to the region. What can we expect from this Arab state plan for Gaza?
I mean, well, first, there's been this discussion that somehow Trump's proposal of ethnic cleansing is like 4D chess, that like what he really wanted was the Arab states to step in because there had already been expressions from the wealthy Gulf countries. They were not interested in rebuilding Gaza for the umpteenth time, only to have it be destroyed again in a few years. And so that this would pressure them, force them to take over reconstruction of Gaza. I don't think that is what Trump was doing. I think he's serious about ethnically cleansing Palestinians. In terms of what the Arab states have planned, I don't have any particular insights on what exactly would be going on there. But I did just want to highlight something Matt said about the ways in which this is a region governed by autocrats. And historically, the issue of Palestine has been an issue that they use to sort of avoid their own shortcomings. And the issue, and part of the reason many of these countries don't want to take Palestinians is not only because they know it would be deeply unpopular, but also the Palestinians have historically been a population that engages in massive forms of resistance. And so none of these autocrats are interested in having large numbers of people who have spent their lives and generations engaging in resistance to violence and repression. At the same time, there is just this question, well, then what do we do for Palestinians in Gaza? What can be done for them? And I do think that the sort of notion that it is somehow more humane to remove them is something that I have heard people have asked me, like, why don't other countries just take them, or like even Europe or the United States to take them? And I think it's, first of all, this was often asked in the context of the ongoing genocide, and so the real question is, well, no, just the violence needs to stop. Now that it has, at least there's a temporary pause, which again I think is very likely to start again quite soon. I think it is useful for remembering kind of how are other populations treated when there's an earthquake or a fire. You know, the residents of LA are not being asked to sort of remove themselves from Los Angeles while rebuilding is going on. They're allowed to stay in their communities and receive help and support there. However, the devil's advocate, the level of devastation in Gaza is such that it remains this open question. And unfortunately, I don't think we can really trust the Arab governments to necessarily look out for the Palestinians themselves.
Anyone else have any insight on what the Arab states might be planning that might move things in a better direction? Matt?
I mean, I don't have any insight on what's going to come out. I will note, as others did, that, you know, when I saw those comments from National Security Advisor Waltz say, "Oh, we're just trying to generate ideas, forced ideas, solutions from the region," my response was, well, they did respond with a solution back in 2002. It was called the Arab Peace Initiative. The Arab League has unanimously re-upped it multiple times, including amending some terms in ways that, you know, that addressed Israeli concerns.
Could you talk about just the details, the basic details? Because most people have
Sure.
no idea
Right,
what
and-
that initiative is
Right.
about.
And again, the response to me on social media is staggering. It's just that people are unaware that this isn't, in fact, a thing. On the table, they've been so kind of marinated in this propaganda that, you know, Israel is constantly seeking peace and getting its hand slapped away. The idea that there was this unanimous proposal led by Saudi Arabia for full peace and normalization in response to an end to the occupation and a resolution of the Palestinian issue, in accordance with past UN Security Council resolutions. That's what it is. I just said it. It's an entirely just and reasonable solution based in international law, a pretty overwhelming international legal consensus. And that's not to say that it addresses all the details. Some of those will, of course, have to be worked out, but it's a pretty huge deal. But the problem is that no Israeli government has ever shown any real interest in it, because again, they don't want to resolve the issue based on international law. They mostly want the land, or at the most want some very attenuated kind of Palestinian statelet that they can continue to manage with, you know, complete control. So again, that's really does come down to, you know, will you accept a solution if it asks the government of Israel to do things it doesn't want to do? And if the answer is no, then this is all just, you know, kind of a ridiculous farce.
Anything on the Arab states peace plan?
Well, I think as usual, it's the Palestinians who are being excluded from any voice in determining their own future, right? So we see how the Trump administration is trying to engage different Arab states in this ethnic cleansing plan. But let's be clear, after the ceasefire went into effect on January 19th, Palestinians made it very, very clear that they were not going anywhere, that they were not going to be forcibly expelled from their homeland. And we saw hundreds of thousands of Palestinians return to the northern part of the Gaza Strip, the area from which Israel expelled so many Palestinians and put a complete siege on that part of the Gaza Strip in order to literally starve out everyone who remained. So Palestinians have made it quite clear that they completely and fundamentally reject the idea that they should be ethnically cleansed from their homeland, just as anyone would reject that preposterous notion. So we, I think, need to listen to what Palestinian demands are. We need to have a Palestinian-led reconstruction process. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, I think we also need to engage seriously with the notion that Palestinians who live in Gaza, those who are refugees, who were expelled from their homes 75 years ago by Israel, have the right to return to those homes today, that they don't necessarily need to go back to a rebuilt Gaza. They should have the option of rebuilding their lives in accordance with UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which says Palestinian refugees have the right to return to their homes. It's really as simple as that. It's the fundamentals of this issue, which have been neglected for now more than 7 decades, that's really perpetuating this. And I would agree with one thing that Secretary Rubio said. We can't keep doing this over and over again. There has to be an endpoint, and that means addressing these fundamental issues of the denial of the human rights of the Palestinian people.
Okay, I want to, eventually bring the audience in, but I want to get back to the point that Anel started to address, and in many ways, it's the most important issue here, and that is the conditions in Gaza today, and whether it can sustain life in the foreseeable future. So I hate to admit it, but Donald Trump does have a point when he says, when you look at Gaza, it's a demolition site. It's not suitable for human living. Just to cite the relevant facts, according to the UN, it would take 350 years to get the economy to pre-October 7th levels. It would take 15 years just to remove the rubble. Gaza is a massive war crime scene. The basic necessities to sustain life, health, education, electricity, water don't exist. Just before this event started, I saw a new Oxfam report that has come out. Israel has destroyed over 1,000 miles of water and sanitation networks, leaving them at less than 7% of pre-war levels. So the question then becomes, if not Trump's crazy Gaza plan, and I don't think that's an option that's really worth seriously considering, what's the realistic plan to save the people of Gaza, given the balance of power between the different forces, given the reality of the Middle East, and given where we are today internationally? We have 2 million people there who are living in the context of a genocide. The means to sustain life are not there. How do we rescue them? What's realistic? What's possible? I mean, that's the penultimate question, in my view, that we need to be thinking about. And unfortunately, things have gone from very bad under Biden to now, in many ways, I would argue, much worse under Trump. So what's the option? We have reports of babies freezing to death. It's going to get really hot there really soon. Are we just going to watch this horror show unfold month after month? So what's the plan? What's realistically possible given the reality of the world that we currently inhabit? I mean, that's the big question. Yeah. An emphasis on the word what's realistically possible, because Israel has effectively veto power over what can happen in Gaza, and I don't see any constraints being put on Israel. Certainly not by this administration.
Gaza has been under an illegal siege by Israel since 2007 that has, even well before this genocide, denied Palestinians adequate levels of food and clean water and all of the necessities that are needed to sustain human life. That's why in the 2010s, the UN put out a report warning that by 2020, Gaza would be uninhabitable. And that was before this just massive destruction caused by Israel's genocide. So yeah, I agree with President Trump that Gaza does look like a demolition site. It does look like that because Israel damaged or destroyed 7 out of 10 of all Palestinian dwellings. They destroyed every single university. They destroyed almost all Palestinian schools in Gaza. They destroyed hundreds of mosques and churches. They destroyed or damaged almost every single hospital. So through this genocidal action, yes, Israel has created the conditions where sustaining life for Palestinians in Gaza is incredibly difficult and incredibly challenging, including the fact that Israel continues to deny all of the access to the humanitarian aid that it promised it would let in as a result of the ceasefire agreement, including for caravans and other forms of sustainable temporary housing. So look, I don't have an answer to this. I'm not a humanitarian aid expert. I'm not an urban planner, but I will say that one of the ways we have to ensure that conditions do not deteriorate further and that Israel does not do anything even nearly approaching this again is to ensure that Israel is held accountable for this genocide. The fact, just like Anel was talking about, how US leaders were never held accountable for the atrocities that the United States committed in the aftermath of 9/11. No Israeli leader has ever been held accountable for all of the war crimes and crimes against humanity that are repeatedly being inflicted on the Palestinian people. This is why the International Criminal Court case against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant is such an important development. And it's the reason why we've seen the United States going to bat for Israel and placing sanctions against the ICC for daring to try to hold these Israeli leaders accountable. Holding Israel accountable for its actions will be the firmest declaration by the international community to say, no, this is unacceptable. This violates laws of war. This violates international humanitarian law, and we're not going to tolerate you doing this again. Only by holding Israel accountable will we prevent even worse from happening in the future.
The same question is on the table. What can realistically be done to sustain human life in Gaza in the coming weeks and months?
I mean, just to echo what Josh said, Israel is not allowing in the very basics that were agreed to in the ceasefire, which again are the bare minimum in terms of temporary housing, some means of basic sustenance, which is just the means for survival. So starting there, and first of all, starting with what the Palestinians themselves in Gaza are asking for, which is to return home, to be allowed to return home, to have the water, to have the electricity turned back on, which was turned off after October 7th, such whatever electricity infrastructure still exists, to any existing water infrastructure that still exists, that has been shut off. So just starting from the very bare minimum and making a good faith effort to actually allow for survival would be the very basic of the most basic of first steps. But that does then leave this broader question. So even if we were there where Israel was actually allowing in aid, it still then leads to this question of like, so we're reconstructing this open air prison for what? Like, what is the plan? And I just, I applaud Josh's point that many Palestinians in Gaza do have homes to go home to in what is now the state of Israel. But that then does raise the question of, well, what would that actually look like? But just to reiterate there that so frequently this notion that it is conceivable and legitimate to displace Palestinians, to displace 2 million Palestinians from Gaza or 3 million from the West Bank, but the idea of displacing 500,000 illegal Israeli settlers from the West Bank, that's inconceivable, or 250,000 is illegal settlers in East Jerusalem, that's not conceivable. So in general, just if we want to actually achieve some kind of out-of-the-box thinking, I think it would be displacing the people who've been so privileged throughout this whole decades-long conflict.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the most urgent thing is to get aid and to get shelter to people, to get medical care to those who need it. You made a point. This is a crime scene as well. And I think that's part of the effort of accountability. And I mean accountability for Hamas as well. I mean, Hamas, the ICC has a mandate to investigate war crimes by both sides. And I think for this process to be legitimate, it must do so. And we should support it in doing so. Ultimately, I think the answer needs to come by supporting Palestinians' right to govern themselves, and we can start that now. I mean, we published a few months ago a piece in the CIP's journal by our fellow Omar Shaban, who some of you know. He is from Gaza. He published, I think, a really smart proposal for the creation of a Gaza Governing Council, which is made up of Palestinians from Gaza who know Gaza, who are trusted by communities in Gaza, dealing with the delivery of humanitarian aid, to dealing with reconstruction, moving the rubble, dealing with basic order, police, things like this, and ultimately feeding. I mean, this is a governing council in which Hamas may have some say, given that Hamas is still very much in Gaza. Let's have no illusions about that. But Hamas will not be governing Gaza. But ultimately, this is designed to feed into the broader issue of Palestinian political unity more generally, which is one of the real problems here. I mean, one of the reasons why Netanyahu was openly bragging about having supported Hamas's leadership in Gaza before October 7 was precisely because it did serve his larger goal of keeping the Palestinians divided, and thus you don't really have to have someone on the other side of the negotiating table to make peace with. So I think solving that problem is pretty key as well.
Okay. Last question, then we'll open it up to the audience. In Trump's infamous press conference with Netanyahu on February the 4th, he did make a comment that I think has largely been forgotten, but we're going to be reminded of it very soon. I picked up on it that he was asked about the future of the West Bank and Trump's policy toward the West Bank. It seems pretty clear to me that within the next few weeks, he's going to announce a shift in U.S. policy, formally recognizing Israeli annexation over parts, perhaps all of the West Bank. That's coming. I'd be shocked if it doesn't happen very soon. If that's the case, what are the implications of that for the conflict, for the broader region, and for U.S. foreign policy and international relations more broadly? A formal recognition of Israel, U.S. recognition of Israeli annexation of the West Bank. Matt?
I mean, the implication. Well, one, I'll be kind of curious to see how the Emiratis respond, given that,
Yeah.
Holding back from annexation was the victory that they claimed in exchange for, the first round of the Abraham Accords. And if they're now, coming out as suckers in that, I mean, what are they going to do about it? Probably nothing. I think we need to watch what kind of response will come from Democrats in Congress. Even with that coming out of my mouth, I know how silly it sounds, but we do have more, I think, champions and courageous members on the Hill now than we have ever had, willing to speak out on this issue in a much bolder way. So I think trying to build some unity there among that cohort of brave members of Congress who really take international law and human rights seriously is going to be important. What we'll see from European partners as well, again, don't have great hopes. Because unfortunately, what we saw under the Biden administration, and I know we're in a new administration, but I disagree with Obama. I think we very much should look backward as well as forward. They did vanishingly little to change anything that Trump did on Palestine. They made a number of promises, whether it was on reopening the consulate, whether it was on the Golan, stuff like that, and they did.
You talk about Biden?
I'm talking about Biden. Yes, sorry. Yes, Biden, when they came into office, and kind of surveyed the landscape and the way in which Donald Trump and David Friedman had just drastically changed U.S. policy. And Pompeo with recognizing the legitimacy of settlements. I think that really did damage in terms of the Democratic Party's willingness to kind of speak truthfully about this stuff. So I am hopeful that we do have a new generation, because as Josh said, the Democratic Party's voter base has moved on this in a very, very serious way. The question is whether we have elected representatives who have the courage to really reflect that.
Well, I mean, one thing in particular, in terms of like watching King Abdullah of Jordan come and sit awkwardly next to Trump and have to sort of sit there as he's talking about displacing Palestinians into Jordan, which would be an existential threat to Jordan. I think like what I took away from that was that Trump is sort of changing the parameters of what has been the basis of US relations with Arab countries for decades, which is that the US will prop up these autocratic leaders and assist in the suppression of democratic movements on the guise of sort of anti-terror, pushing back against Islamist movements. But the US will help keep these rulers in power. And so if Trump requires Abdullah to commit what is essentially political suicide by accepting Palestinians, that changes the calculus for rulers across the region who say, I thought the whole basis of our partnership with you guys is we buy your weapons and you help keep us in power. If you're forcing us to now do something that is going to get us out of power, on what basis would these countries continue to be willing to partner so closely with the United States? And certainly in the post-Cold War moment, the US was the only game in town, but that's not true anymore. And so although obviously we know that China is not interested in extending the same kinds of security guarantees that the US has to these countries, there are other countries that, whether it's China, Russia, there are other configurations of power that these countries could look to in saying, I don't think it's really necessarily the best policy anymore for me to be so closely tied, for my security to be so closely tied to the United States. So I don't know that Trump or his team have fully grappled with what it is that he is potentially requiring Jordan to do here.
Trump is potentially breaking the rules of the protection racket.
Mm.
I think that's what we're seeing. That's a great point.
Josh?
Yeah, I think it's important to think back to Trump's so-called deal of the century during his first term, where the proposal was that Israel should be allowed in advance of any negotiations with the Palestinians to annex whatever lands in the West Bank it wanted to, right? Before, every single other deal is come to an agreement between yourselves on what Israel should annex. That was the premise of Camp David and all other U.S. Quote unquote peacemaking efforts in the past. In the spirit of what Matt was saying about how Trump just dials it up to 11 and says the quiet part out loud, let's acknowledge the fact that for more than half a century now, the United States, both Democratic and Republican administrations, have issued platitude after platitude. Please, Israel, don't colonize the Palestinian West Bank. You're foreclosing the window on a possible two-state resolution. We've heard this same old track play over and over and over again for more than 50 years. And with the exception of the George H.W. Bush administration, no consequences were placed on Israel for continually colonizing this land in violation of international law that is supposed to be set aside for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. And George H.W. Bush did that by holding up some loan guarantees, but only for a few months. So we have to take account of the fact that for more than 50 years, Israel has been in the process of de facto annexing large swaths of the West Bank. Let's take into consideration that even at the height of the Oslo process, Israel only transferred partial or full autonomy to the Palestinian Authority in just 40% of the West Bank. The rest of the 60% of the West Bank, Area C, was reserved for exclusive Israeli control and sovereignty. And that's still the situation that exists today. So Palestinians made a historic compromise in which they recognized Israel's usurpation of 78% of historic Palestine and said, we'll just take the 22% remaining in the West Bank and the Gaza for an independent state. But Israel then took 60% of that 22%, right? So we have had this long-term process of de facto annexation underway. What's scary, I think, is that right now we're seeing steps for Israel actually taking measures to promote the de jure annexation of the West Bank. We saw this in an example about how the Israeli Ministry of Defense is now taking the powers of its so-called civil administration and having it not under military control, but under civilian control. So what this means is that Israeli civilians are now exercising power instead of the Israeli military over the occupied West Bank. Under international law, this is basically de jure annexation. So what Trump is proposing with his policy guidelines that he revealed in this news conference with Netanyahu a few weeks ago is basically to formalize what's been underway for a long, long time and to place Palestinians under formal apartheid in perpetuity without this pretense that we're having some kind of peace process that eventually leads to a Palestinian state. But at least the scales will have fallen off of everyone's eyes in this scenario. At least everyone will understand then, finally, that Palestinians are facing this apartheid situation, even though they have been for more than 75 years. But I think that'll be increasingly difficult for anyone to deny.
Okay, now let's turn to the audience. We have about 25 minutes. The standard rules apply. Short questions, comments, no speeches, and we'll go until 5:30. First question here at the front. Jonathan, do you have a microphone? Yeah, just keep your hand raised. Okay, there you go. Just there you go. There's a microphone.
Thank you for your talk. My question is, how would you approach the situation if you were in the position of Israeli leadership or President Trump? Specifically, what strategy would you employ to address the humanitarian and security challenges in Gaza? Thank you.
Well, the question is, what would you do if you were Trump or Israel? We're seeing what they're doing right now, right? If you're Trump, you would articulate this ethnic cleansing plan. The answer to your question seems to be quite self-evident. Did you want to fine-tune your question or add more specificity to it so we could answer it? Because I don't really see a question that needs answering. We sort of know what the answer is already, which is the basis of this event today. Okay, what a better policy would be. A different policy. Do you want to answer that, Matt?
Sure. I mean, I think a better policy would be one that upheld U.S. law and upheld international law. What a concept, you know? One that kind of conditioned, followed U.S. law with conditioning U.S. military aid to militaries based on their human rights practices. We have volumes of evidence that these laws have been abused and violated by Israel and frankly by the Biden administration and continuing now by the Trump administration as we continue to see these abuses. So start there.
The pushback that, Josh, that you get is, as you know, is that helps Iran. That helps Hezbollah. That helps Hamas. That's not going to give security to anyone except our enemies.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that's the pushback, but that's very, very silly. It was very, very clear that, Hezbollah and Iran were not seeking to get fully involved, much to Sinwar's disappointment. That was clearly his intention. And yeah, I heard those excuses from the Biden administration officials. It never made much sense to me. They certainly never made sense to me once it was Israel that then decided to, escalate the war after being told repeatedly that if we pull back from Israel, then Iran and Hezbollah will escalate, which I was never convinced by, and I think was a bunch of BS. And now, especially now, given the situation that Hezbollah and Iran in, I think the idea that this would create an opening for them, again, makes even less sense. So again, I'm one of these crazy people who think we should probably err on the side of upholding existing law. We have a huge body of international and U.S. law that argues for doing this, and at the same time, really putting pressure on Israel to allow more humanitarian aid in, and having, as I said earlier, an end goal of getting out of the way for the Palestinians to really handle their own affairs. Again, this is not something we can do or any country can do for the Palestinian people. This is something that they understand very well. I mean, we have this a leadership in the West Bank, the PA, that's old, out of touch, is corrupt, but they're there because we want them there. They're there because they're delivering the main thing we asked them to deliver, and that is security for Israel, not security for their own people. There's actually a great deal of very interesting work being done by Palestinian activists, some of them who have affiliations with the PLO and the PA, and some who are much more independent, but trying to think through what it will take to reconstitute the Palestinian national movement. Not only in a way that can think through, the future for Palestinians, but also to generate a leadership, and actually legitimate leadership that can eventually sit across the table from the state of Israel and resolve this issue. And I think that's where, U.S. policy cannot do that, but it can get out of the way.
You want to weigh in on this? Okay, go ahead.
Oh, well, just really quick to finger on your sort of argument, or your the notion that that would empower Iran or Hezbollah.
Not my argument, someone else's argument. I'm just
the devil's
echoing
advocate that you're making. I mean, to fully put to rest the issue of Palestine would be one of the things that could fully defang many of these movements and actors that gain so much strength as a result of the injustice that has been perpetrated against Palestine for decades. And so if I'm an Israeli leader, if I'm Trump, and my primary concern is really, or should be theoretically, what is in the best interest of Israeli security, it would be to create conditions where you have the Palestinian population is invested in this outcome, in a status quo that achieves justice and security for them as well. And whether that ends up being a state alongside, or equal rights and justice for Palestinians inside of Israel. But that's the only way long term to achieve security for Israelis, is security and justice for Palestinians.
Do you want to weigh on this, Josh?
I'm pretty sure that neither Trump nor Netanyahu would be taking my policy advice, but here it goes. Number one, recognizing self-determination for the Palestinian people. Number two, recognizing that Israel imposes an apartheid system of rule on the Palestinian people between the river and the sea. Number three, recognizing the unjustness of this and recognizing that the only way to remedy this is to decolonize end this apartheid situation so that everyone between the river and the sea has freedom and equality and equal rights.
Next question. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm concerned about the accountability. It seems to me you guys are focusing on the wrong thing. Our country, the United States of America, is why they got away with what they've done in the last 4 years. And I look and I realize, and this is a question, it is a question. I think our press, the information that came out to us, I think if the American people had really been able to see what was happening, the level of destruction of this country, I do not believe as a country we would have had someone from to be our new defense head who is going to turn our government into the IDF. That he specifically says to hell with the Geneva country, you know, how I think our look has to be first at our country. And I would like your response to that.
The problem is us.
Yes.
100%. I agree. Israel cannot get away with its genocidal actions toward the Palestinian people without the lockstep diplomatic and military support that we have provided it, not just over the past 2 years, but over the past 75 years. Look, Congress appropriated $18 billion of weapons to Israel, and those were appropriations signed into law by President Biden. So when we look at Palestinian children burned to death and dismembered, those were from US bombs that were dropped by Israel from US aircraft and attack helicopter gunships. Those were US missiles dropped from drones over the skies of Gaza. We are not only complicit in Israel's genocidal violence towards Palestinians, we're partners in crime. Absolutely 100. So yes, we have a huge responsibility here as citizens of this country to push back on the immoral and illegal policies that our government pursues. And like Matt was saying earlier, we have the laws in place that are supposed to address these issues, that are supposed to center human rights in our foreign policy, that are supposed to ensure that US weapons are not used to commit atrocities against other people. And we can talk, all three of us, I'm sure, can talk in great detail about the Arms Export Control Act and the Leahy Law and the Foreign Assistance Act and all of those other things that are great on paper, but which never get implemented. Not only in regards to Israel, but also in regards to our foreign policy and arming of other regimes around the world. So I agree, it's a systematic problem with US foreign policy. And when President Biden says, for example, that we need to make human rights the cornerstone of our foreign policy, yeah, I agree, but that needs to go beyond, well beyond the rhetorical and to actually be the focus of our foreign policy.
Let's take another question or comment. Yeah, right here up at the front, Jonathan.
Thanks so much for this. I'm wondering, where are the cases at in the ICC and the ICJ? We know there's been a shuffle around with the head of the ICJ. I can't remember her name, the Ugandan woman who's pro-Israel. We're always threatening sanctions at ICC, but where are the actual cases at? One. Two is what actually has been guaranteed so far. When King Abdallah came here, he said we'll receive 2,000 injured and sick children from Gaza. Has anything else actually been guaranteed?
Yeah, there's two questions there. Pick any one. What's the status of the ICC arrest warrants on Netanyahu? I think it's pretty clear to say that, well, he was in the White House a few weeks ago, so not much has changed. But anything else you want to add on the question of the ICC or the secondary question that was asked as well?
I mean, just on the ICC, I mean, yes, Netanyahu was in the White House. He was disallowed and then allowed to come to Poland for the Auschwitz event. Germany has said that they will not enforce. This is all disappointing and, of course, really kind of sad. But, I was in Israel about a month ago. I was actually in Israel when the ceasefire agreement came together as it happened. And even amongst Israelis I spoke to, the impact of this is very, very real. So again, has it done exactly what a lot of people hope?
The impact of the ICC
Of the
arrest
ICC warrants, yes.
In what way? Could you say a bit more?
No, just that an Israeli prime minister and an Israeli defense minister have now been, these warrants are now out for these two leaders. So again, we can argue about how much does that really matter, but their country, their national reputation does matter. And the fact that these two leaders now have been included with these leaders of Hamas, but now have been added to this kind of international blacklist, like the Milosevic's and others who are acknowledged to have carried out some of the very worst crimes. This does make a mark, so I would not completely dismiss it.
Yeah, just one added point on the ICC. I don't know if anyone read Trump's executive order against the ICC. It was so draconian, so punitive, that when I read it, I had the thought that if I were to organize, let's say, an American Friends Society to support the International Criminal Court, that I could be in legal jeopardy for doing that under this new executive order. That's how extreme things are in this country with respect to the ICC under this Trump administration. So if you don't believe me, read that executive order. I was sort of shocked at how extreme it was in terms of trying to undermine its reputation and its mandate. Next question. Yeah, right there, and then you're next. Go ahead.
Thank you all for being here, and congratulations on finishing your dissertation. Speaking on the same point of being held accountable, earlier there was a comment was made about Hamas should be held accountable as equal as Israel needs to be held accountable. Are the two entities seen the same in might and power? And if they are, what do the Palestinians people have to resist what's been happening on their land? Thank you.
I would not making an equivalence. I don't want to get into those kinds of questions. In my own view, there's no equivalence between occupier and occupied. But again, I was just kind of stating a matter of fact that the ICC's mandate empowers it to investigate crimes carried out by all sides in the territory of Palestine. And that includes war crimes by Palestinian factions as well. So clearly there's a massive power differential there. I wasn't suggesting otherwise. I was just trying to say that as someone who wants this to be a legitimate process, who recognizes the value of the ICC and thinks we should support it, come and get me, Donald Trump, but thinks we should support it. I think that goal is served by the process being seen as legitimate. And that means carrying forward with the fullness of its mandate, which again involves investigating crimes by all sides.
We have an online question here that speaks to things that we've already talked about, but I'll ask it anyway to the panel. Is there any way the U.S. can force Israel to end the occupation and its apartheid policies and accept a one-state solution where everyone would have equal rights, regardless of religion, that would also include the Palestinians' right to return? In other words, a big shift in U.S. foreign policy toward the direction that I think most people who care about international law, equality, basic principles of justice would agree with. That's not everyone, but how can we get the U.S. to sort of shift its policy in that direction?
Just if there were an administration who were committed to making this happen, yes, Israel remains dependent on the United States for 70% of its military capabilities, for massive amounts of money the United States sends to it every year. So if there were an administration that were actually interested in having that be the outcome, yes, and it would have the support of the international community as well. I think the question, one thing that's interesting about U.S. support for Israel, which is different from how the U.S. supports other countries with military aid, is the U.S. is actively involved in subsidizing Israel's defense sector such that it can become increasingly autonomous and independent in a way that other countries are not allowed to do that. They're not allowed to sort of have access to the same kinds of technology, or so in many ways, increasingly Israel may find, and as politics shift on this, I imagine that Israel may increasingly want to become less dependent on the United States for its security, knowing that there is a generational shift happening here, and to acknowledge what the audience member said about how Americans would have been opposed to this if they could see what was happening. I think we observed that with young people who had access to what was happening, who weren't getting their information from mainstream media, who could see on TikTok what Israel was doing, which is why their opinion shifted so greatly on this, and why the Biden administration tried to ban TikTok. It wasn't about China, it was about Israel. So I think that to the audience member's question of could the US do this? Yes, but moving forward, that may become less and less possible.
Josh, this is right up your alley.
I think the United States has tremendous leverage over Israel. And just to bring up one historical example, when Israel colluded with Great Britain and France in 1956 to invade and occupy Egypt, President Dwight Eisenhower was aghast at this colonial move. And he said to David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli prime minister at the time, I'm going to impose multilateral sanctions on you in the United Nations. I'm going to cut off all forms of U.S. economic aid to you. And I'm also going to ensure that there are no private donations from the United States going to Israel unless you withdraw from both the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, which was under Israeli occupation at that time also in 1956 and 1957. And do you know what Israel did? It withdrew from the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula and it withdrew from the Gaza Strip. So this is proof positive that we have tremendous leverage over Israel. And that was even before the days when we provided all of these weapons to Israel, which it relies upon for its suppression of the Palestinian people. So of course we have the power, we have to use it.
Matt?
I mean, I'd be very cautious at saying the United States can force any country to do anything. But what we can do, which I will say, is we can at least stop making sure that there are no consequences, because that's where we are now. I mean, that has been the policy of the United States essentially through the entire peace process, is that there will be consequences for only one side, the weaker side. That is where pressure will be focused. For the more powerful side, there will be only carrots. There will be only presents. There will be only good things that will happen if you do this. And what we found repeatedly over and over again is that Israel is happy to accept the presents and then accept more presents, you know, while continuing to do what they were doing. I mean, it's very rare that that's created any positive movement. You can get an occasional temporary settlement, partial settlement freeze that way. But I think this is the kind of bizarre, and this kind of logic doesn't really apply to any other diplomatic situation. I mean, we understand, we should at least, that in any negotiation, there's going to be incentives and disincentives, consequences and benefits, carrots and sticks, whatever term one wants to use. At long last, let's reapply that basic logic to this.
Yeah. Let me push you a bit further, Matt. You were Senator Sanders' chief foreign policy advisor. Had he become president and you were advising him, what would you have advised President Sanders to do to establish these types of consequences that would force a change in Israeli policy? Could you give us a short list?
Oh, that's not a short list at all. No, it's one is I would have made clear ultimately what we want to see. I mean, that clarity is something I think that could be just useful at the outset.
For example,
we want to see an end to the occupation. We genuinely want to see Palestinian liberation, Palestinians able to govern themselves, to build their own future, whether that's in two states or in one state. That is something for the Palestinians and Israelis to negotiate eventually, without treating this as if you're talking about two equal sides right now. Again, getting back to the power differential here, but stating very clearly what U.S. policy is, bringing U.S. policy back into accordance with international law, and declaring clearly settlements are illegal. The occupation has gone on too long. It is an illegal occupation. Efforts to ensure that, to kind of consolidate that occupation as a permanent control are unacceptable, and that sanctions and nonviolent steps to oppose it, either by civil society or by governments, including the United States, are entirely legitimate. So you don't have to come out of the gate, hard, but you do, I think, what I would have advised would say, let's at the very beginning be clear about what the United States policy was and stand ready to work with those leaders amongst Palestinians and Israelis who shared that vision.
Okay. Yeah, question right there. Just stand up. Just stand up and we'll get you a microphone. Yep.
So, since you're talking about American policy, and Josh just talked about how in the past 75 years, American policy has been pretty consistent, except with a little bit there with Eisenhower. How do you articulate a U.S. policy that explains that it is in the U.S.'s national security interest to not let all of this stuff happen with Israel and to promote a lasting peace in the Middle East and Palestine? Because everything that you've explained, adherence to international law and human rights and all of these things, they're esoteric concepts that, as we all know, they're implemented and imposed only when it's in, this country's interest. It's not consistent.
Yeah.
And more broadly, how do you articulate a geopolitical situation where any nation or a group of nations can stand up to Israel and the United States, given the current state of affairs in the world right now?
So let me just re-articulate the first part of her question. What's the realpolitik, the realist argument for a shift in U.S. policy on Israel-Palestine? That is in our, put the ethics and the normative sort of arguments aside. How do you make the realist argument that a shift in U.S. policy in the direction of, justice for Palestinians benefits us? Matt?
Just start, say, what we've been doing over the past several decades has been enormously costly in terms of American time, energy, credibility, money. Just in those terms, it's been a massive waste. I think your point is a very fair one. I mean, do Americans really care about international law and all these things? I think Americans care when American leaders articulate why this is good for American security and prosperity. And I don't think that's a particularly difficult argument to make. Americans, our security and prosperity is bound up with the security and prosperity of people around the world. When we work to diminish disease and deprivation, we are all safer. Now, obviously, Americans want to make sure that they are safer first and their communities are more prosperous first, as do people in any country. So you really do need to be able to show that you're actually delivering that before you can get people to take seriously these kind of high-flown ideas of, international law and international norms. But I would say Americans were for a long time very supportive of, the effort coming out of World War II to build a system of international norms, international multilateral institutions that address these questions, because we had leaders who were very interested and who understood the urgency and the necessity of doing that to make sure that we didn't have, a third world war. And I do think we've lost some of that. And again, I don't want to be naive here. I don't want to pretend that we built the United Nations and all these other organizations just out of the goodness of our hearts. I mean, American interests were deeply embedded in the design and function of these institutions, but I do think they were also built upon a logic of shared security.
We're going to take one last question, but does anyone on the panel want to respond to this issue about the realpolitik, realist argument that would justify a shift in American policy?
Well, and just to add to what Matt was saying, and as we were talking about earlier, that the issue of Palestine is so central to, like, Palestine radicalized bin Laden. Like the issues of terrorism and terrorist recruitment and this entire country's whole security agenda after 9/11 was all about protecting against terrorism. Well, if Palestine had been resolved, that would have gone a long way to sort of taking the wind out of the sails of movements and governments who sort of portray their legitimacy as deriving from resistance to American and Israeli imperialism. But I think Matt's point is equally important, because I don't want to overinflate the issue of terrorism. But just, how central is the Middle East to U.S. security interests or U.S. national interests writ large? I mean, maybe when oil was a larger, when the United States wasn't the largest exporter of oil and we were fully dependent on oil from this region, it made more sense, perhaps one could argue, for the Middle East to be such a big part of our foreign policy. But at this point, it's really just like a hangover, or just sort of this belief that we have to continue to maintain a massive military footprint there. I mean, the Middle East is the largest customer of American weapons. And I mean, so much of this really isn't driven by what's actually U.S. national interest. I mean, so much of it does come down to the domestic politics of the Israel lobby, as well as the sort of biblically derived view that essentially like Christian Zionism, which I only recently learned long predates Jewish Zionism. That sort of this notion that the Jews should be back in Palestine to facilitate the second coming of Christ goes back to like the Renaissance. So I think very much centering the overarching role of the United States here. And to add one other thing to Matt, while I totally agree with him that Palestinian self-determination should be foremost, I think also any sort of outcome, the international community and the United States in particular would need to help to foster that, recognizing the power differential that we are dealing with two very unequal powers. And so in order to achieve some kind of an outcome that achieves justice, we can't just sort of leave it only to sort of Israel and Palestine. But because the international community and the UN were involved in this outcome and the long illegal occupation, it is up to the international community moving forward to try to find a just resolution.
Josh?
So I did my dissertation work in the Truman administration era, and at the time when the UN was debating whether to partition Palestine and establish a Jewish state in a portion of it, there was wall-to-wall consensus among all of the agencies involved in geostrategic thinking on US foreign policy. We're talking about the State Department, the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, naval intelligence, military intelligence. All of them agreed that by the US supporting the establishment of a Jewish state, it would have severe negative ramifications on US foreign policy interests broadly defined in the region, which were primarily two: access to military bases and the protection of the flow of oil. And I would say those Truman administration officials were wrong. Support for Israel in US foreign policy has not harmed these US geostrategic interests in the region. If anything, US geostrategic interests in the region have been furthered through the Trump administration. It was Matt who mentioned the Abraham Accords. We've now seen how a number of Arab regimes have normalized relations in exchange for weapons from the United States without resolving any of the fundamental issues that deny Palestinians their right to self-determination. So in other words, the United States has had its cake and been able to eat it too, because they've been able to support the establishment and maintenance of a Jewish state in Palestine against the wishes of the indigenous inhabitants of that area, and they've been also able to reap major geostrategic benefits by establishing bases and access to oil throughout the region.
Okay, we're going to end it there because we are past our time. If you have a question, you can come up afterwards and ask the panelists. I want to thank the panelists for taking time to be with us today. Please join me in thanking them. And our Gaza lecture series, as you can see, continues next Tuesday. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Oh, yeah, we have a lot of free food that I believe is free for the taking. Take it home or give it to a homeless person in your area. Thanks.